The countdown to the 2026 FIFA World Cup was supposed to be a victory lap. Stadiums were rising, sponsors were locked in, and the United States was preparing to welcome the largest sporting event in human history. Then, with no warning and no diplomatic groundwork, everything fractured. Just months before kickoff, a sweeping U.S. travel ban was signed by Donald Trump. Overnight, citizens from multiple European, African, and South American nations, countries with qualified teams, broadcast contracts, and millions of ticket-holding fans, were barred from entering the United States. The decision landed like a seismic shock. Airlines halted routes mid-schedule, team logistics collapsed, entire delegations were suddenly stranded outside the host nation of their own World Cup. The global sports calendar does not bend easily, and it certainly does not forgive uncertainty. Within hours, international carriers began canceling charter flights. National football federations issued emergency statements. Security teams, medical staff, referees, and broadcast crews, many of whom had already secured visas months earlier, were told their paperwork no longer mattered. The machinery that keeps a World Cup functioning grind to a halt. For FIFA officials, the implications were existential. The World Cup depends on one non-negotiable principle: free movement. Fans must be able to travel. Teams must be guaranteed entry. Sponsors must trust that their investments won't be undermined by political impulse. That guarantee had just evaporated. What was once a celebration of global unity now looked like a logistical nightmare unfolding in real time. Host cities across the United States felt the panic immediately. Hotel bookings froze, event planners stopped answering phones, local organizing committees, already deep in debt from stadium upgrades and infrastructure spending, were left staring at spreadsheets that no longer added up. The promise of packed streets and sold-out matches was replaced by the fear of empty seats and international embarrassment.
Abroad, the reaction was not confusion, it was fury. Governments whose teams had qualified legally, fairly, and years in advance were now being told implicitly that they were no longer welcome. This was not a dispute over visas or security protocols. It was a blanket political decision, issued without consultation, that treated the world's most watched sporting event as collateral damage in a domestic power play. The symbolism was devastating. The United States was not just hosting matches, it was hosting the world. And in a single stroke, it signaled that global commitments could be revoked without warning. In international capitals, the question was no longer whether the World Cup would be disrupted. The question was whether the United States could still be trusted to host anything of global consequence. As the hours passed, the scale of the crisis became impossible to deny. This was no longer a policy dispute, it was a rupture between sports and politics, between allies, and between America's image and its actions. The world's biggest tournament had entered freefall, and the country at its center was the source of the chaos. The economic damage followed immediately, and it was brutal. What had been projected as a $15 billion windfall for the United States began evaporating in days. That number wasn't abstract. It was hotel workers in host cities counting on overtime. It was small restaurant owners who had taken out loans to expand. It was airlines that had scheduled thousands of additional flights to move fans across continents and time zones. When the travel ban hit, those plans didn't slow down. They collapsed. Major host cities saw mass cancellations ripple through their economies. Hotels that were supposed to be booked solid for weeks suddenly sat half-empty. Short-term rental markets imploded. Local governments, which had justified billions in public spending on stadium upgrades, transit expansions, and security infrastructure, were left holding debt without the tourism revenue meant to pay it down. Municipal bond markets reacted fast.
Credit outlooks darkened. The World Cup was turning from a once-in-a-generation boost into a fiscal liability. Airlines were hit particularly hard. Transatlantic and trans-Pacific routes tied directly to World Cup demand were canceled or consolidated. Charter contracts were voided. Aircraft sat idle while fuel hedges and staffing costs kept bleeding cash. Stock prices dipped as investors reassessed whether the United States had become an unreliable hub for large-scale international events. This wasn't market panic. It was rational repricing of risk. Corporate sponsors felt the shock next. Brands like Adidas and Visa, which had poured billions into global marketing campaigns built around the World Cup's message of openness and shared experience, suddenly found themselves tied to images of blocked airports, stranded fans, and diplomatic outrage. These companies don't just sell products, they sell stability, and now their logos were appearing alongside headlines about exclusion and chaos. Behind closed doors, executives began asking uncomfortable questions. Could promotional events even be held? Would fans be able to attend matches wearing sponsor gear if they couldn't enter the country? Would broadcasters pull back, reducing global exposure? Sponsorship contracts are built on assumptions of access and goodwill. The travel ban shattered both. Damage control teams went into overdrive, not to salvage profits, but to protect brand credibility in markets far beyond the United States. The ripple effects spread outward. Construction firms tied to last-minute World Cup projects saw contracts delayed or canceled. Event staffing companies laid off workers. Merchandise suppliers were left with warehouses full of unsold inventory designed specifically for U.S. host cities. Even tech firms providing ticketing, security, and data infrastructure faced renegotiations as attendance projections cratered. This was a self-inflicted wound, and everyone knew it. No natural disaster had struck, no global health crisis had emerged. The collapse came from a single political decision that ignored the interconnected reality of modern economies. The World Cup is not just a tournament, it is a synchronized global operation. When one link breaks, the entire chain snaps back. By the end of the first week, the message from markets was unmistakable. Hosting the world requires predictability. The United States had replaced it with volatility. And as billions in projected revenue slipped away, the question haunting investors, city officials, and corporate partners alike was no longer how much money would be lost, but whether it would ever come back. Europe did not negotiate. It did not plead. It did not ask for exemptions. The response was immediate and icy. Football federations from across the continent issued coordinated statements condemning the ban as a breach of prior guarantees. Governments that had spent years preparing, securing training bases, arranging logistics, investing millions in fan travel, saw their plans erased without consultation. What Washington seemed to expect was pressure, bargaining, leverage. What it got was silence. Calls from U.S. officials went unanswered. Emergency diplomatic channels stalled. In Brussels, the European Union treated the ban not as a sporting inconvenience, but as a political affront. The issue was no longer soccer, it was reliability. If commitments made to the world's largest tournament could be discarded on a whim, then any promise made by Washington was suddenly suspect. The emotional core of the backlash mattered as much as the logistics. Players had trained their entire lives for this moment. Fans had saved for years, booking flights and accommodations long before qualification was even secured. For them, the ban wasn't abstract policy. It was exclusion, delivered at the peak of anticipation. European media framed it bluntly. The host nation was locking the door after selling the tickets. Instead of backing down, the White House escalated. Tariff threats were floated. Trade pressure was hinted at, as if economic coercion could force compliance.
But the strategy misread the moment completely. This wasn't a bilateral dispute where leverage could be applied quietly. This was a global spectacle unfolding in public. Any concession under pressure would have looked like surrender, not just for politicians, but for institutions that pride themselves on autonomy and rule-based order. So Europe stopped engaging. The calculus shifted from damage control to contingency planning. Football associations began exploring alternatives. Broadcasters asked whether matches could be relocated. Legal teams reviewed hosting agreements for clauses tied to freedom of movement. The unthinkable, partial or full removal of matches from the United States, was no longer taboo. It was practical risk management. What stunned American observers was the unity. There were no visible cracks. No country broke ranks to secure special treatment. The message was disciplined and collective. If the World Cup could not be hosted under fair and predictable conditions, then the host had failed its obligation. Full stop. This was the moment the balance of power tilted. For decades, the United States had relied on its centrality, economic, cultural, institutional, to absorb friction without consequence.
This time was different. The World Cup gave the rest of the world leverage through legitimacy, and Europe used it by refusing to legitimize chaos. In private, European officials spoke candidly. The concern wasn't just this tournament, it was the precedent. A world where global events could be hijacked by domestic politics was a world where long-term cooperation became impossible. Stability, not spectacle, was the currency that mattered now. By the time Washington realized the pressure wasn't working, the damage was done. The phone lines were quiet. The assumptions of automatic alignment were gone. And in that widening vacuum, created not by foreign rivals, but by American choice, new actors began to see opportunity. While Washington spiraled, Ottawa went quiet and then decisive.
Mark Carney understood something immediately that U.S. leadership missed entirely. In moments of global disorder, power flows to whoever restores predictability. He did not give fiery speeches. He did not publicly criticize the White House. Instead, he treated the crisis like a systems failure and moved to stabilize it. Within days, Carney's government began discreet consultations with European capitals. Not emergency summits, not press conferences, private calls between finance ministries, foreign affairs officials, and national football federations. The message was simple and disciplined. Canada could guarantee entry, security, and continuity. No surprises, no politics at the border. At the same time, Canadian officials opened quiet channels with FIFA. The legal groundwork was already there. The 2026 tournament was a joint hosting agreement. If one host failed to meet core obligations, especially freedom of movement, the burden could shift. Carney's team didn't frame this as a power grab. They framed it as risk mitigation. The language mattered. Coordination extended south as well. Mexico, already uneasy about the instability emanating from Washington, was brought into the loop. The goal was not to isolate the United States publicly, but to build a parallel structure that could function without it if necessary. Redundancy is how serious systems survive shocks. What made Canada's move so effective was its tone. There were no triumphalist leaks, no nationalist framing. Carney positioned Canada as a service provider to the global community, competent, boring, reliable. In a crisis defined by impulse and volatility, that was precisely what the world wanted. European leaders noticed the contrast immediately. Where Washington issued threats, Ottawa offered guarantees. Where the White House created uncertainty, Canada offered timelines, protocols, and legal clarity. It felt less like diplomacy and more like crisis management led by adults in the room. Behind the scenes, logistics teams began mapping contingencies. Stadium availability was assessed. Transportation corridors were modeled. Immigration officials drafted expedited procedures tailored specifically for teams, staff, media, and ticketed fans. None of it was announced. All of it was ready. This was not opportunism. It was strategic patience. Carney understood that legitimacy in moments like this is earned, not declared. By the time the world began openly questioning whether the United States could still anchor the tournament, Canada already had answers prepared. The balance of the conversation shifted. Instead of asking how to pressure Washington, global stakeholders started asking a different question. If parts of the World Cup had to move, where would they be safest? For the first time since the crisis began, there was a sense not of relief, but of direction. Chaos still dominated the headlines, but quietly, methodically, a new center of gravity was forming north of the border. Canada moved from planning to execution with remarkable speed. Within days, Ottawa announced an expedited World Cup visa framework, fast-tracked, centralized, and insulated from political interference. Teams, staff, media, and verified ticket holders were given clear timelines and guaranteed entry. There were no vague promises, no discretionary language. The policy was written to remove doubt. For international federations and fans watching from abroad, it felt like oxygen returning to a room that had been suffocating. Host city capacity was expanded almost immediately. Toronto prepared to absorb additional group stage matches and training camps. Vancouver accelerated stadium readiness plans and reopened negotiations with broadcasters. Transportation authorities coordinated with airlines to reallocate international routes away from U.S. hubs and toward Canadian gateways. What had once been contingency planning was now operational reality. South of the border, Mexico moved in lockstep. Mexico City was quietly floated as a potential site for relocated knockout stage matches. Legally, the justification was airtight. FIFA hosting agreements require the host nations to guarantee free movement for qualified teams and accredited participants. With the United States unable or unwilling to do so, redistribution was not punitive, it was procedural. The optics were devastating for Washington.
While U.S. officials argued on television about sovereignty and leverage, Canada and Mexico were doing the work. Immigration officers were trained, security protocols were harmonized, cross-border coordination centers were established. The tournament was being rebuilt in real time, without the country that was supposed to anchor it. For fans, the contrast was impossible to miss. Where the United States offered uncertainty, Canada offered welcome. Social media filled with images of maple leaf flags at airports, multilingual signage, and clear instructions instead of confusion. It wasn't propaganda, it was competence, and that made it more powerful. Behind closed doors, FIFA's internal discussions grew more serious. Scenarios once considered extreme were now treated as plausible. Partial relocation, major match redistribution, even the possibility that the most watched games of the tournament might take place entirely outside the United States. None of this was announced publicly, but the signal was unmistakable. What Canada had achieved was not just logistical readiness, but moral authority. By stepping in without gloating, without confrontation, it reframed the crisis. This was no longer a story about punishing the United States. It was about protecting the integrity of the World Cup itself. And as that narrative took hold, something subtle but profound happened. The world stopped asking whether Canada could handle the responsibility. It started assuming it would. The turning point came not in a press release or a summit, but at 35,000 feet. As the travel ban took effect, the Germany national football team was already in the air en route to the United States for final pre-tournament preparations. Their destination was Miami, where training facilities, security details, and media schedules had been booked months in advance.
Mid-flight, confirmation arrived. Entry was no longer guaranteed. Clearance was uncertain. The risk of detention, delay, or outright refusal was real. The decision was made quickly. The plane turned north. When the aircraft touched down in Toronto, there was no chaos waiting on the tarmac. Immigration officials were already briefed. Security protocols were activated. Documentation was processed smoothly, professionally, and without spectacle. Within hours, the team was transported to accommodations, training schedules were adjusted, and media access was granted under clear guidelines. What could have been a humiliating disruption became a seamless transition. Images spread globally within minutes. Players stepping off the plane, calm and composed. Canadian officials welcoming them without cameras shoved in faces. No shouting, no confusion, just order. The contrast was stark and impossible to ignore. In Germany, the symbolism landed with force. Broadcasters framed the diversion not as an inconvenience, but as a revelation. One country had closed its doors without warning. Another had opened them without hesitation. The message required no commentary. It was visible in the footage. For FIFA executives, this was the moment the crisis stopped being theoretical. The operational proof was undeniable. Canada wasn't just promising stability, it was delivering it under pressure, in real time, with one of the world's most high-profile teams as the test case. Every contingency memo suddenly felt outdated. A new baseline had been set. Washington, meanwhile, looked frozen. The image of a World Cup contender rerouting away from the United States was devastating. This wasn't a boycott. It wasn't a protest. It was a safety decision made by professionals protecting their athletes. And that distinction mattered. It stripped away political spin and left only consequences. Other teams took note. So did sponsors. So did fans. The diversion became a reference point in every subsequent discussion about logistics, trust, and leadership. Quietly, it reset expectations. If Canada could absorb disruption without drama, why should anyone tolerate uncertainty elsewhere? What unfolded on that flight captured the entire crisis in a single frame. American authority faltering midair, Canadian competence waiting on the ground. No speeches, no declarations, just action. From that moment on, the narrative was no longer abstract. The World Cup had already begun to move. One plane, one decision, one landing at a time. By the time the tournament arrived, the damage extended far beyond football. What the World Cup exposed was a deeper fracture in global trust. For European governments, multinational corporations, and international institutions, the lesson was blunt. The United States could no longer be assumed to separate domestic politics from global obligations. The travel ban didn't just disrupt a tournament, it rewired risk calculations across diplomacy, finance, and long-term planning. Quietly, priorities shifted. Investment funds began favoring jurisdictions seen as predictable and rules-based.
International conferences and major cultural events reconsidered U.S. venues. Talent pipelines, researchers, engineers, creatives, looked north, not out of sentiment, but out of pragmatism. Stability had become the scarce resource, and Canada was signaling it could provide it. Ottawa leaned into that perception carefully. Trade envoys emphasized continuity. Immigration policy highlighted clarity and speed. Diplomatic language stressed reliability rather than ambition. Canada didn't claim leadership, it absorbed it, and in doing so, it redefined what middle power influence could look like in a volatile world. The contrast with Washington hardened. Allies began hedging rather than aligning. Communication with U.S. agencies became more cautious, more legalistic, more conditional. The assumption that America would always be the default anchor of the global system was replaced with a quieter question: what's the backup? The World Cup became the symbol of that shift, not because of goals or trophies, but because it revealed how fast credibility can evaporate and how quickly it can be transferred. One country chose exclusion and unpredictability. Another chose openness and competence. The consequences followed naturally. For Canada, the gain wasn't dominance, it was trust. And in the modern global order, trust compounds. It attracts capital, it attracts partnerships, it attracts influence without coercion. By stepping in when the system wobbled, Canada positioned itself not as a challenger to the United States, but as the place others could rely on when the United States could not. For the U.S., the reckoning was quieter but more severe. The loss wasn't just economic or reputational, it was structural. Once global actors learn they must plan around you, your leverage diminishes permanently. That lesson does not reverse easily. Long after the final match, the memory that endured wasn't the scoreline, it was the moment the world adjusted its expectations and kept moving. The World Cup did not merely reflect a changing global order, it accelerated it. Key takeaways from the video. A sudden U.S. travel ban issued by Donald Trump throws the 2026 FIFA World Cup into immediate crisis, disrupting teams, fans, sponsors, and global logistics. The decision triggers a massive self-inflicted economic loss for the United States, wiping out billions in projected tourism, hospitality, and sponsorship revenue. Europe refuses to negotiate or submit to pressure, choosing unity and contingency planning over compliance. Canada, under Mark Carney, responds quietly and strategically, offering stability, legal clarity, and competence instead of confrontation. Canada and Mexico step in to stabilize the tournament, proving that global leadership is earned through reliability, not rhetoric. A single symbolic moment, the diversion of a major national team's flight to Canada, crystallizes the shift in global trust. The World Cup did not merely a reflection a changing global order, it accelerated it. Canada's credibility and Canada's rise as a trusted global partner. Life lessons you can apply. 1. Reliability is power. People and institutions gravitate towards those who are predictable, fair, and consistent, especially in times of crisis. 2. Silence plus action beats noise. Canada didn't argue loudly, it simply solved problems. In life and work, execution often speaks louder than opinion. 3. Short-term emotion can destroy long-term trust. Impulsive decisions may feel strong in the moment, but can permanently damage reputation and opportunity. 4. Preparation creates opportunity. Canada was ready before the world asked. Being prepared allows you to step forward when others fail. 5. Leadership is service, not dominance. True leadership often looks boring, calm, and procedural, but it's what people rely on when stakes are high. Positive message for the audience. This story is a reminder that influence doesn't always come from size or force. It comes from trust. In your own life, whether at work, in family, or in your community, be the person others can count on when things go wrong. Calm, clarity, and competence will always outlast chaos. Call to action. If you value clear, powerful storytelling that connects global events to real-life lessons, support the channel PT Audio. Like the video. Subscribe for more deep, accessible geopolitical analysis. Share this episode with someone who cares about how the world is changing. Your support helps PT Audio continue turning complex global stories into insights that matter. Disclaimer. This video is a narrative-driven geopolitical analysis intended for education and discussion purposes only. Some scenarios are hypothetical and used to illustrate broader political, economic, and social dynamics. It does not represent official positions of any government, organization, or individual. Viewers are encouraged to seek multiple sources and form their own conclusions.